The 2026 International Colloquium Series Europe is sponsored by the Episcopal Diocese of California, the Tabernacle Community Development Corporation, the Waters Living Trust, and Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. With university sponsors, Pepperdine University, the University of Geneva, the Graduate Theological Union, the Catholic University of Leuven, and the Catholic University of Lyon. And community partners, the Cathedral Church of the Holy Trinity, the American Cathedral in Paris, the Chemin Neuf Community in France, Emmanuel Episcopal Church of Geneva, the Center for Liberation Theologies at the Catholic University of Leuven, and the French-speaking Institute of Systematic Theology and Ethics at the University of Geneva. With the 2026 hotel partner, Nest M Gallery, Paris La Défense, an Accor luxury hotel. And special thanks to the following: Dr. Christophe Chalamet, Dr. Estelle Sogbu, Dr. Judith Gruber, Dr. Dara Straub, Kim Powell, Dr. Anne-Marie Reinen, Dr. Raymond Carr, Dr. Valerie Miles-Tribble, and Colette Rogers Grizzell.
The Northern California Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Community Foundation is dedicated to promoting justice, health, education, and service. Please consider making a donation at NorcalMLKFoundation.org. Every donation makes a difference.
It's hard to tell you, but the E of credo is backwards, it's flipped in a mirror in monk mode. And then the second one, signifying monk. Karl Barth and the ellipsis of the imagination of matter, coming up with Cascade books. So we're really delighted. Actually, because Raymond and Valerie are part of this trip that we selected the theme of theology.
Yeah, and jazz.
Theology and jazz. Since you have published this trilogy that people will be able to look at. So we're delighted that you are here, part of the delegation, as I call it. And I give you the floor right away. Thank you.
I want to thank you for inviting us. And he's quite the aesthetics fan himself. So I can see just by watching you play, you got a little monk in you. I also want to, hear that term delegation. It sounds like you owe me money or something. So I get kind of scared with that language. But I want to begin today with a quote. And this quote is from another singer and songwriter. His name is Leonard Cohen. You all familiar with Leonard Cohen? He's a Canadian. He has this beautiful song that the quote goes like this: "Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offerings. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." And that song is one of the reasons I often appeal to this quote by Leonard Cohen, is because in it, he speaks to our limitations and our possibilities, our insights and our oversights, our relationship to categories, taxonomies, and classifications we create, and the problems they create for us. The categories and comparison quite often that we create sometimes become the thief of our joy. That's a famous idiom saying. In fact, even the title of my work, Theology and the Mode of Monk, is a critique of classifications, categories, genres, on and on. In fact, that's why it's not theology in the mode of jazz. Jazz artists like Chico Hamilton and others, they don't describe their music as jazz. They say that's Monk's music, that's Miles' music, that's someone else's music, Mary Lou's music. You see, and because the category itself can function as a powerful mode of discourse. The same thing happens in theology. So it's important for us to think about these. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do what we do or that the category can't be important. I love this conversation, especially the literature of theology and jazz. But notice I did not say that. And I did this on purpose because what I'm doing in the title is to shift to a type of particularity. I'm looking at Monk in particular. And notice I said a kind of particularity, not degree. It's often important in theology that we talk about kind rather than degree. And we have a tendency to become preoccupied with degree. How much? How many? In fact, if I were to compare Monk to Karl Barth, and this is not a part of the paper, one of the things that makes me think about is that Karl Barth is sort of like the musician Art Tatum, who Oscar Peterson loved. When Art Tatum is at the computer, or I'm sorry, at the piano, it sounds like 2 or 3 people, right? But when Monk is at the piano, you're saying, hey, why is there so much space? And it's my argument that the only way you follow Karl Barth, who's written as much as 2 people can write, is you got to follow him in the style of Thelonious Monk. And so that kind of informs the work that I'm doing in some sense. And so part of what I'm also doing here today is that I'm engaging in a type of theological play or thinking that I'm interested, that pushes me in a peculiar direction in response to that peculiar subject matter, who's above us, below us, around us, and in us. It's that subject matter that Karl Barth would call the Zaka. He's talking about God, okay? And so we're not simply speaking about jazz in history. We're speaking about something else. And listen, history is noble. One of my good friends named Willie Jennings wrote a book recently, and you should read it. It's on the book of Acts. And he talks about the nobility of history and what it means to think history and think like a historian, but that's not what the writers in the book of Acts are doing. Even though history, again, can be an important way to think about the world. I'm always reminded of Cicero, whose famous phrase, Historia Magistra Vita Est, which is history is the teacher of life. So we don't want to overlook history, but we don't want to reduce God to our history. There's a lot we could say about that today. So it gives me the pleasure today, actually, to introduce you to one of my favorite people. That's Thelonious Monk, who was born in 1917 and died in 1982 on February 17th, which is my birthday. It's one of the reasons I've been drawn to Monk in my own way. And Monk was affectionately known as the high priest of bebop. He was a brilliant pianist who emerged on the jazz scene during one of the most generative periods in jazz history. It was called the bebop period or the bebop era. Had its heyday in the 1940s. And bebop or bop, as it was characterized by a number of different people, was also about a kind of digital dexterity, how fast you're playing. And they were critiquing swing and other forms of jazz that preceded it, and so you couldn't dance to bebop like you could for swing. I'll say more about that here in a second. And it was epitomized by artists like Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Bird Parker and Mary Lou Williams, who helped Monk and Bud Powell with their pianism, helped them to learn how to play better. It was an extraordinary and revolutionary movement tied to the peculiar cultural zeitgeist and historical impulses in America. Cornel West, the philosopher, described it this way. He identified bop as, quote, a revolt against the middle-class jazz of the museum, against swing and white musicians whose styles had become culturally hegemonic. Bebop, in this respect, signalizes a historical period where a kind of coming of age for Black jazz artists and Black people in general resonated with a cultural shift in mood. In fact, bebop and jazz in general is viewed as America's classical music. So you think of your classical music. Or the book I sent around where Karl Barth wrote about Mozart is somewhere in here, and James Cone wrote a book on the spirituals and the blues. Right? But Mozart would be a part of that classical music that's tied to Europe. Jazz is tied to America. And sometimes rather than calling it a democracy, they call it a jazzocracy. It just depends on who's talking about it. Okay? And so when we look at bebop and we think about Monk had a predilection for playing bebop jazz that revolved around playing and dancing within contrasts or tensions or juxtapositions that are not necessarily strict contradictions. And I think that's how we should be thinking in theology. In that Hebrew genre in the Old Testament, you find it in the New Testament also. Things are sometimes in juxtaposition without being a strict contradiction. God is both transcendent and immanent. There's the freedom of God, and it is your freedom. There's a prophet, Add the priest, you see? Juxtaposition, but not strict contradiction. And in the juxtaposition, there's tensions and possibilities that we move within. You see, part of the beauty. And I see this when I look at Karl Barth, who emphasizes theology from above. That's why the head up there, when you see that, those are two pictures of Monk up there. Notice the one has a bright light around it, sharper silhouette. The one below has the blue around it, that's Cone. And you can see a little bit more of the hat. I did this on purpose. And they both are looking from the vantage point of angles, even though they're emphasizing the center in different ways. By the way, neither one of them is at the center. God is. You see? But nevertheless, because of the way Barth looks from above, Barth will say something like, God is God. Cone will say, God is black. And there's a way in which those two things come together. That's not a part of the paper. And so Monk plays in these juxtapositions. And it's no secret that Monk was interested in how things struggle with their opposites. For example, while other beboppers played more dexterously, Monk played in the way that Oscar Peterson described. He said that Monk played more pensively. In this pensive way where every note mattered. This playing with intentions was somewhat akin to the dialogical tension. When we talk about the relationship between us and God, it is not reducible, in fact, to the way Monk played his music. It resides first in Monk's mode of thinking about music, informing my theological approach that I've come to call a kind of hermeneutical musicality or harmonious thinking. You'll find that in some Jewish traditions, okay? Or just Monk mode. In Monk, you'll hear this thinking, first of all, in his witty aphorisms, characterized by sometimes three-word phrases like, two is one, or hear the light, which is really important because we put so much emphasis on seeing. T.F. Torrance talked about the idea that we need to move away from this visual aesthetic to a more, maybe some other kind of aesthetic, like an oral aesthetic. Because we'll say things like, see what I mean? We'll say, you hear what I mean, right? And so we in the West, we're kind of captured by a certain kind of optic. You find that optic in history. And so this is why in German, they make a distinction in German language between Historie and Geschichte. You see? One is emphasizing the facts of history, the details of history. The other one is talking about history as event that's happening, possibilities. And that's how the New Testament writers are thinking about history. Right? It's on the move when you get to the book of Acts. God is on the move, so the church is on the move. I hope you're on the move. Let me keep reading. All right. And so when you look at this way that Monk played, in fact, Monk, one of the things that, in other words, he's going in a different direction. Let me say it that way. Knowing that a good melody is not just what you add. It may be in what you subtract. Okay? It may be in what you subtract. That is, if you're going to improvise on it. At any rate, even these pithy statements routinely set up tensions and contrasts and incongruities that provide insight into Monk's aesthetic mode of thinking and the resultant stylistics that arise from that thinking. And for many American blacks, these stylistics provide insight into an African-American aesthetic mode of religious apprehension, which then shapes what it means to do theology in the mode of Monk, or black theology, and other womanist theology, and other theology that emerge out of the black experience, which are very important for us not to overlook because they can contribute to how we think as a whole. Let me keep reading. Monk's approach to tensions and contingencies can be heard in how he listened for music. Yusuf Komunyakaa, the poet, Monk requires us to be active listeners, listening for the way he actualizes his melodic imagination. He says it this way. Monk's music requires an active listener, someone who doesn't have to be told the whole story. Wouldn't it be something if we thought the Bible was telling us the whole story? And it was telling us part of the story. That's why we call when we look at the Gospels, right? We identify the Gospels in a way where we give it different language and normal biography. See? He says there's an emotional elasticity in Monk's music, Monk's world. Things that seem at odds with each other fit side by side. The human mind does the framing inside and outside of conventional references. And so in this section here, I'm going to share with you in a minute here what brings me to Monk, or why I chose Monk. And let me say this in another way, why Monk chose me. And so I'm going to show you something here really quickly. Let me skip that. All right, I think I did the wrong button. Just want to move that to the next screen. I think it goes this way. There we go. Now we're moving. And that's a free article you can find online that I wrote while teaching at Harvard, The Dancing Monk and the Rhythm of Divine Life. So if you want to look up something free and you don't have to buy the books, you can go there first. Let me keep moving. All right, and so when we look at Monk, we can raise the question I just addressed to some degree who Thelonious Monk is, all right? And so now I want to let Monk's friends introduce you to him just a little bit, and then we'll come back, all right, after on the other side.
His melodies were beautiful. His chords were unusual. His colors, his rhythmic sense, and the spiritual feeling in the music. When you heard his music, it just carried you away.
The most difficult thing about Monk in the studio was a combination of his perfectionism and his really basic, I think, inability to understand what the hell was supposed to be so difficult about his music. You know, the attitude that he understood it, why couldn't you?
Some unusual phrases. Monk wasn't like that, you know. So Monk was like a real free spirit who said, I'm going to play this way. This is what I want. And he played stuff that nobody else ever played. Who really stuck to their gun and got what he wanted out of what he wanted to do. You know, there's very few people who make it doing what they want to do. Monk went through a period of not making it, but he still was Monk. When he made it, he still was Monk.
He epitomizes what a jazz musician is supposed to be. He has a style which is instantly identifiable, whether it's in composition, whether it's in his playing, or whether it's someone playing along the lines of Thelonious Monk.
All right, so I wanted you to see that and be introduced to Monk a little bit. That last part is very important when we start talking about Monk's individuality or individuation and how he has this kind of subjectivity, which is accounted for me an offset over against Bart's emphasis on Mozart and Mozart's objectivity. Allows me to bring these two thinkers together. But I want to say a little bit more about this because people often ask me, and again, this goes back to my earlier point about why jazz or why not jazz. But people often ask me, and I'm going to come back to that at some point, people often ask me, why Monk? Or they'll say things to me, you know, they'll say, well, how did you discover Monk? And I often tell my friends, I did not discover Monk. Monk discovered me. In other words, Monk's musical aesthetic or musical imagination helped me to find myself within the grand scheme of theological ideas, ideologies, and even institutions. Monk's way of or mode of framing his jazz provided a kind of order for that disorder. Now, one of the reasons is because he's known for improvising on the melody. And that allows these possibilities around the melody. I'll come back to that. Another way to say this is to say that monks' way of signifying, and that's a Black tradition. Signifying. It's like if I look at you with your legs crossed right there with that blue shirt on, I say, oh, there you go with your legs crossed again. I'm throwing something in and I'm signifying. Or I say, I see you rubbing your back there. And that's a way of signifying. It's a way of changing the conversation. And jazz does that. And in African Americans, it's one of the major tropes within African American life that we signify, right? And I grew up in a household that always signified. Oh, there you go. And my nickname at home is Joey. There you go again, Joey, smiling, right? They were signifying on me. Okay. And so when we look at this, another says, so monks signifying help me to signify on the signifiers. What do I mean by that? There's a sense in which when you're African American, Europe has already signified on you. You come speaking English. You ain't come from there. You're in a country where you're not even there voluntarily. You came in voluntarily. So your positionality is already different and it has already been signified upon, you see. And so there's a way in which jazz artists recognize that and they hear each other and they signify back and forth in the music. And so you have to be really listening for the music in this way. To be sure, there are already certain notions within theological traditions that press themselves upon various cultures and traditions. Well, monk helped me to find a signal in the midst of that noise. Another way to say this, volume 431 in Karl Barth's Church Dogmatics, he talks about this idea that there are certain ideas that are ad extra or outside the church that might press themselves upon you. It might be your family background, it might be something else, but it ends up becoming a part of you and it becomes a part of your call. And how do you understand yourself in relationship to that thing that is That's what monk has done for me. So when I hear the question, why monk, or does monk have, what does monk have to do with theology, and what does theology have to do with monk, I'm often suspicious of the question. I want to wrestle with these kinds of questions. I want to wrestle with their relevance, their pertinence, because questions are so often inflected with meaning that we don't acknowledge, filled with presuppositions that reside within the context of the question itself. This is why I often tell my students on the first day of class, learn to question your question. They'll say things like, where does Adam and Eve come from? I says, the text asking that question? Now, they can ask the question, but the questions themselves need to be interrogated. And I love the way that Hans-Georg Gadamer, the hermeneutical scholar, says it this way. He says that questions allow us to own up to our finite contingency. So why monk? Why Thelonious Monk? Asked the jazz enthusiast. What does theological thinking have to do with Thelonious Monk? And what does monk have to do with theology? And what the enthusiast is really asking is, why did I choose monk over John Coltrane's Love Supreme? Or Bud Powell's virtuosic digital approach to jazz? And why not one of the other beboppers like Charlie Bird Parker or Dizzy Gillespie? Why monk? They're asking me. And I explained that there are many reasons for this. I shared one with you earlier. He died on my birthday. Also grew up across the highway from the first Black asylum in America's history. And monk was often dealing with asylum. Another reason I like monk. First, and also, is that personally, no one's style is as distinctive as Thelonious Monk's style. His audacity in terms of self-expression is arguably, so you might know someone, unparalleled, but he's fearless. There's this term we use in theology, parrhesia, for fearlessness, to go your own way. And as Billy Taylor, the dean of jazz, just pointed out in the video, he epitomizes what you expect in a jazz musician. His style is instantly recognizable, whether in composition, as being played by Monk, or played by someone else. See? It is this idiosyncratic aspect of Monk's music that parabolically reminds me that a theology, at least one primarily that emerges primarily from below in Black traditions, needs something that helps to reveal that. So I'm interested in this kind of numerologically understood Christology that addresses what the Bible calls archaisms, or these different gifts that we have that doesn't just come to your personal gifts, but might emerge out of a particular community. That gift might emerge. The question we have for the church today is whether the European church and even the American church have really heard the charismata of the Black church and the Black experience. It's a big question. Have they really heard it? Now, the enthusiast may, again, ask that question in that way, but the theologian should ask a different question. The theologian should ask, maybe more like, how, Monk? How does Monk help you to articulate this vision? How does Monk help you to think from below to above, or to come to terms with a different point of departure that has its ground in what Charles Long might call the crucible of Black experience? You see, they're asking a different question than that person who just want to know why I chose a particular artist. What the theologian should ask is a question that honors the den of life with its angularities, its rhythmic displacements, and concrete cultural contingencies that make a distinctive Black style of life or Black style of music that informs theology. See? This distinctiveness affirms our peculiar humanity, for God is speaking to us and God is speaking from us, even outside the walls of the church. This is what Karl Barth called extramuros ecclesia, the word of God that speaks outside the walls of the church. Charles Long, who was the one that encouraged James Cone to write the Spirituals and the Blues, he called them extra church realities. Do we hear the extra church realities? In fact, in what way might the extra church realities help us to see realities we don't acknowledge? And this is why I like to hang out with jazz artists, even though they mess up my circadian rhythm. You see, I'm messed up right now. We're talking about that earlier. I'm on a whole different circadian rhythm because I'm traveling like a jazz artist. Got my colleagues are waiting for me to show up. All kinds of things are going on here. And so following this line of thinking, we can come to terms with how Monk's music itself becomes a key to open up our theological and religious imaginations, transforming our thinking, allow us to think in new and different ways and possibilities. In short fashion, what I plan to do for the rest of this lecture, and I'll try to do it quickly, is to play in and around what Monk is doing. I'm gonna give you maybe about 4 or 5 ways. I'm gonna improvise, all right? If I need to stop in relationship to the clock, we'll do that, all right? And so, but I wanna think about these, and I wanna use one sentence, and that is this idea that Monk played in the tensions. And I'll let you see it here. So again, why Monk? I was discovered by Monk, how Monk helped me find myself, and also one of the things that pointed to is this kind of intellectual modesty that we should have for the people who went before us, the people alongside of us, and people who will come after us. We should always be open to truth in that way. Okay? And so we're going to see that Monk had this ear for the past. In fact, he would play the past with his left hand, stride piano, and with his right hand, he would improvise. So he ends up inspiring what's called free jazz. That wasn't part of the lesson. You don't have to pay me for it. Let me move on. All right. And so when we look at Monk and his fascination with music, now, one of the first questions I'm going to look at is how Monk played in the tension. Why Monk and how we turn to Monk. And Toni Morrison, the great literary artist, is going to help us to think through that, okay?
You have in your writing certainly marginalized whites. Why are they of no particular interest to you, or seemingly no particular interest?
Well, I was interested in another kind of literature that was not just confrontational, Black versus white. I was really interested in Black leadership. And I wanted to do, I think, for me, the allegory or the parallel is this Black music, which is as splendid and complicated and wonderful as it is, because its audience was within its primary audience. The fact that it has become universal, worldwide, anyone, everyone can play it, and it has evolved, is because it wasn't tampered with and editorialized within the community. So I wanted the literature that I wrote to be that way. I could just go straight to where the soil was, where the fertility was in this landscape. And also, I wanted to feel free not to have the white gaze in this place that was so precious to me, which is the work.
And you will maintain this safe place for yourself, for your art? You don't think you will ever change and write books that incorporate white lives into them substantially?
I have done.
In a substantial way?
You can't understand how powerfully racist that question is, can you? Because you could never ask a white author, when are you going to write about black people? Whether he did or not, or she did or not. Even the inquiry comes from a position of being in the center.
And being used to being in the center.
And being used to being in the center. And saying, you know, is it ever possible that you will enter the mainstream? It's inconceivable that where I already am is the mainstream.
And I wanted you to see that because first she said she doesn't want to be confrontational. It's not black or white for her. She's looking for a place of freedom for her to write her literature her way and not to be ordered by somebody else's center. And so she goes to the border and creates a new center and watch the world, she says in another place, move around her. And so we just left a place yesterday, American Cathedral. And one of the things they were arguing was, hey, why aren't you guys more angry? And we were shocked by the question, especially when you're dealing with the blues, where there's this ironic tenacity. You know you got this thing, you can't do, forgive the language, a damn thing about it. And so you decide to do something about it. And part of that tension and paradox is the humor. We'll get to that in a second. You see? And so, but you're saying, wow, we're angry. You think Thelonious sat down at the computer and says, no, hold on. Before I make this song, I think I need to be angry about what white people are doing. It changes the whole direction and inflection of what he's doing, you see? And so when I think about what Monk does to me, it's this point where his music contributes as a medium or a cultural idiom or language, I'm using that term in that way, to provide a methodology for me to engage in theology that is parabolically suggestive, functioning in both a self-critical deconstruction and simultaneously constructive mode of thinking, or to use the apt word, German word, Aufhebung, right? In other words, through Monk's musical aesthetic, I establish a theological framework that is self-critical, avoiding the trap related to Cohn's emphasis on subjectivity, and affirming of humanity, avoiding the trap related to Barth's emphasis on objectivity at the same time. Because he's improvising on the melody and he's recognizing the possibilities around it. He's even making scrap notes. The song you heard earlier on was called Blue Monk. And it comes from a song called Pastel Blues. If you listen to the inside of that song, you'll get the fragment that Monk turned into a whole song. Beautiful. When you open the door to possibilities, that in between the cracks, there are possibilities. And Monk was known for that. One jazz artist said, I've traveled with musicians who could play all the white keys, and I've traveled with musicians who could play all the black keys. But I've never traveled with a you-know-what who could play between the cracks. And Monk found music in between the cracks, in between the possibilities. That's what I see when I engage theologians like Thomas Merton, or Dolores Williams and James Cone, or Karl Barth and James Cone. You see, there are these possibilities that exist because their various angles don't capture the whole thing that we're in pursuit of. James Cone said it this way: with all brilliant insight, there's some blindness. So we always want to stay open to the beauty of the possibilities. How am I doing with time? I want to make that move short and respect my colleague here. We're doing okay. You let me know when I get within about 3 minutes or so, all right? Perfect. All right. In other words, Monk's musical aesthetic helps to establish this framework that I just noted was self-critical in this way. This framework allows me to think using an aesthetic mode of religious apprehension that emerges from Black life. So when jazz enthusiasts ask me why Monk, they're asking one question. But when theologians are asking me this, they should be thinking about another. Allow me to demonstrate this with other relevant points, playing off of this idea of the way Monk played in intentions. And I'm going to try to skip through this pretty quickly, all right? So notice, I'm going to do something that I learned again from these German theologians, a Swiss, Karl Barth, and he'll emphasize a particular word within a sentence. So the first thing I want you to notice is that Monk played in intentions. And it's very important that we acknowledge Monk for who he is and how he plays without making a cult of personality. Don't want to do that. We got that going on in America right now with Trump. a cult of personality building around a particular person. But we do have to acknowledge, again, his audacity in playing the way that he played. One of the things I like about Monk is that he's not religious. That's why I didn't choose John Coltrane. I often tell my students that biblical faith is not about being religious, it's about being radically human. But being radically human includes God and the religious things you do, properly situated. Our problem is that they tend not to be properly situated. And I'll say also, I'll follow it up and I say that we don't become human so we can become Christian. We become Christian so we can become more radically human. Right? And the word radical means to get at the root of what it means to be human. And what I like about Monk is I see within his life, his love for his family, his struggles. I see someone that's radically human. The brokenness of the music itself, the dissonance, the rhythmic displacement, the fact that he's playing it with flat fingers when you're supposed to play like a cat. He's not being determined by the categories. Are you all with me here? I get excited about this stuff. Pray for me, all right? And so when I see this in Monk, he played in the tensions. And we see this with Toni Morrison, who's trying to turn in some way to tap into that. Charles Long is wonderful, again, scholar you heard me mention several times. I have his books and papers, all of them in California with me. That's one of the reasons why he tends to come to my mind. There's a whole lot of papers and books. But one of the things that Long would often say is that for African Americans, there's a way in which when we try to change our lives or get involved in that change, that we have to see the transforming process itself as something we're deeply engaged in. So transformation for the African American becomes an art of life. That's the subtitle of today's paper. Theology and the Mode of Monk, transformation as an art of life. And one of the most important lessons I've learned from listening to Charles Long is that transformation is a part of the process, without reducing it to a process. Meaning, we're coming to terms with that imagination that we have. It's the key to which Blackness signifies upon the powers that array themselves upon the Black imagination. Long, in fact, argues that the divine is not merely working within the historical events themselves. It is a combination of historical events and the Black religious consciousness. Moreover, the deity, that's the way he says it. He doesn't say God. He said the deity is at work among Black Muslims and Black Jews. In other words, God is at work in these extra church sources, which would include Monk's music. So part of what we have to do is to learn to embrace what the transforming process means itself. And this kind of consciousness is seen in Monk's terms and his willingness to go his own way. And encourage me to do likewise theologically. I'm not just trying to do what Bart is doing or do what Cone is doing or do what Black folk are doing. I'm doing my own thing. And that's what happens when you do that. I'm going to show you something that happened. Breaking correctly is it costs you. One of the things about Monk you learn from reading about his life is that he had what's called the unyears. And those are years that were very difficult for him. And this is one of his quotes. I say, play your own way. Don't play what the public wants. You play what you want and let the public pick up on what you're doing, even if it takes them 15 or 20 years. And that's what happened to Monk. Found himself, everybody talking about Dizzy Gillespie and all these guys. And those guys learned from me. And he had to deal with that and not allow that to become cynicism over being overlooked. You see? And so he's wrestling with that. And this is part of what it means to wrestle in that transformation process. And one of the beautiful things when we talk about Monk, and I'm going to say this really quickly here, that Monk was known as the only bebopper who never played bebop. Because he's a revolution within a revolution. Watch me use them suggestively, right? When you have a revolution within a revolution, you have something that revolutionizes a revolution. That's God's revolution. It's beyond it in some way, calling it to task, always checking it in some way. And so being part of this transformation itself, or the process, that means transformation is not something you're working toward. It's something you're working from. It's like hope. Hope is not something, wishful thinking you weren't working toward. You're working from hope. King was working from hope. Same thing with peace. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It's the steadiness that you have in conflict. And you see this when you look at Monk. Thus, in his playing with all this flat-fingered stuff and all these other things that go on, in some way he's breaking away from being categorized. It's beautiful, and I'm skipping through this paper real fast. All right? Okay. And so also one of the things we'll see with Monk is that Monk played in the tension. That's important. Don't miss that word play. He played in attention, because what you'll find in attentions, and I'm skipping here, you'll find what's in the African American tradition, which is, we call it this capital P play, which is a kind of ritual play. I wrote a book, actually it's a chapter in the book, and it's called How Play Informs Work. I'll give you one example. In Thomas Jefferson's Notes on Virginia, he was listening outside the slave quarters, and he couldn't imagine why they wouldn't go to bed earlier. Why are they up all night frolicking around? What he didn't understand, it was that play that informed their work the next day, not the work that informed their play. I always got friends who say, I work hard to play hard. No, I play hard to work hard. And when the kind of play I'm talking about is a kind of redemptive notion of play. Again, that German word, erlösen, and that word, a loosening, a relaxing, a slackening almost, where Jesus worked, or you said his burden becomes light because you're not grounded in the results in some kind of way. But in the African American tradition, you'll find this notion of play at work. It's a profound idea that shapes who we are. That's why the blues and jazz and some of these wonderful art forms become ways that informs our life and give us a steadiness. That's why Baldwin talks about the ironic tenacity you find in the blues. And guess what you get in Monk? A ludic quality in his music. It's called ludus. It means a spontaneity, a kind of play that emerges. And in fact, sometimes it's kind of campy. He's playing it. It's playful, you see, and that playfulness is a part of the beauty of the music. How we doing with time?
Fine.
Okay, all right. I'm just saying, appreciate it. I take all you give me. All right, and so here we're going to see that Monk played in these tensions. And so we want to think about that capital P play, ritual kind of play. Here's how Bell Hooks described that notion of play. I want you to hear this really quickly. One of the things that she said, and again, we're talking about this ludus, this idea. There's a book that actually looked at this notion of play. What Bell Hooks says is she talks about this idea that what has handicapped us, and this is a quote, what has handicapped us historically is that elements of play have not been part of the white supremacist Eurocentric mode of discourse within the academy. So to some extent, social mobility required us to enter into a social contract where we suppress both the capacity and the desire to engage in cultural rituals of play. Signifying, she says, is a skill, a method of disengagement which allows you to unwind. I think of it as breakdancing and art where you see the body deconstructing itself, so to speak. Not like the kind of breakdance we saw in the last Olympics. It's a little different than that. It's showing you how you can move and control parts of your body you didn't realize existed within the realm of self-discipline and control. Right? And by the way, you asked me earlier, you said, hey, do you play? I always get that with jazz folk. Did you play? I said, no, I don't play music. I play in the music. I was a break dancer. I used to do backflips into a windmill. Now I would break something if I tried to do that. All right. But this is sort of how, when you think about Monk, this is how to play. This idea of play. And then we see it in the in-betweenness, because in between, again, is where you find those tensions that you can play in. All right. And the music in between the crack that I talked about earlier. I said I would come back to it. And I want you to let you hear this just real quickly. This is a very short clip. And I want you to see how Monk is bending a note on a particular song. It's called Monk Point, which is very relevant. Now, the last point that I'll make is that he didn't just Monk played in the tension. He just didn't play in the tension, but he played in the tensions. And what I mean by that is that there's, when you look at that language, and that S, I put the S within the parentheses on purpose. One of the things that Monk did that was a key signature to his music was he was known for, he would say to his colleagues, he says, if you want to make a good song, you should improvise on the melody. Improvise on the melody. And he didn't like free jazz because he thought it left the melody. And it was the fact that, and they thought he was conservative because he played on the melody. I mean, anybody that listens to Thelonious Monk and thinks he's conservative, you can imagine that they're coming at it from a different perspective. And part of the beauty of emphasizing on the melody is that it allows for the development of the counterpoints. It allows for you to have the dissonance, the rhythmic displacement. There's a great quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer who says in his prison letters, he's talking about love here. But one of the points he made is he says that where the cantus firmus, and that means fixed melody, and Monk was known for playing on a cantus firmus, okay? Where the cantus firmus is clear and plain, the counterpoint can be developed to its limits. I love that notion. And it's Bonhoeffer that helped me to understand Monk theologically, and Monk that helped me to understand Bonhoeffer musically. Because what Monk allows for is possibilities you don't find in Mozart. You don't find in other traditions. And these possibilities becomes ways and modes of reflecting truth. So he plays in those tensions. In fact, there's a point when you look at the periphery, like what Toni Morrison was talking about, that there's this notion of where the periphery can understand itself within relationship to a center, a mysterious center. And it becomes an eccentric position. It's as important as the position that's at the center. It's Toni Morrison, you see. So I'll close saying this, and then we can have a very brief conversation in relation to Monk playing and intentions. And again, Monk played on the cantus firmus. Everything else, the remaining elements, the sequencing of the song, including the rhythms and harmonies, and even spaces and silences, were determined by their relationship to the melody, or what he called the cantus firmus. This is how Monk dealt with the surplus. Monk's music, as a result of his aesthetic approach, can function then as a handy metaphor for theologians and others who think through what it means to hear the melody of the divine in the midst of the world. This melody, of course, finds its center in the mystery of Jesus Christ, who in the Assumptio Carnis, the assumption of the flesh, expresses a radical openness toward the polyphony of voices within the world and encourages us to improvise and dance to the divine melody. In essence, the incarnation takes on an aesthetic form in Monk's music, and Monk's music takes on a theological form through the incarnation, even while remaining what it is, just jazz. Mm-hmm. The question is, what does it mean for us? What does it mean here in this space? What does it mean for us to improvise on the melody? What does it mean for us to have a kind of unity in the midst of the disorder? Could Monk in some way, through the way that he played in the tensions, bring order to our disorder? Thank you. Wow. I don't know what happened with that song.
Thank you. Maybe we'll hear it another time. Maybe later we can figure it out.
Yeah, well, I love that. Yeah. And I really want you all to hear this one at some point. This is called "This Is My Story, This Is My Song." And you can hear the Monk really is about, it's actually a chorus. You can hear him playing in those tensions. All right.
The International Colloquium Series, confronting global issues with moral clarity and intellectual depth.